So one of my viewers told me I needed to check out Robert Sapolsky and his concepts of free will so that I could really get an in-depth education on things that actually matter when it comes to philosophy and life and concerning religion and whatnot. And so I began to dig into this and find out he's a neuroscientist, and he's written a book, and he's well renowned for studying baboons in Africa. And so I was like, well, this should be interesting. I want to dive into this and see where he comes up with the concept of free will from. And so in this article, Timothy Revel actually interviews him, and I'm going to read you a lot of this interview, but not all of it. I'm going to leave some parts out. And as I'm leaving Timothy's side out, but we're gonna compare and contrast some thoughts. So I was told to go to Robert Sapolsky, and to investigate his concepts of free will. And here's the way the interview response pops out. Yes, I turned 14 years old at one point and had somewhat an existential unnerving experience. And that night woke up around 2 a.m. and said, aha, I get it. There's no God, there's no purpose, there's no free will. And it's been kind of like that ever since. This is the renowned Bob Sapolsky, the one that we're supposed to be paying credence to, who at the age of 14 just got it. He just understood from an existential experience. That almost sounds religious. That almost sounds like a religion. It sounds kind of weird, to be honest. It sounds like confirmation bias. He had these concepts since he was 14. Think about that as we go through the rest of it. And Bob is known for going out into the deep jungle and studying the baboons and their wildlife. But my thoughts with that, and somehow or another, that sheds light on the human brain and how it works. And, by watching these patterns of animals run around. But how do you do that without, putting something on these baboons to measure brain waves and putting them in the lab and screening them? Like, we can do a lot of stuff like that in very expensive labs, but out there in the field is where he gets this insight. Well, he talks about, then we have to deal with the bigger issue. I know it seems very straightforward and simplistic by now to me that there's no free will, but the massive issue is, my God, what are we supposed to do if people actually start believing this? How are we supposed to function? That is a pretty big deal, because anybody that's had any kind of management experience or any kind of, enhancement experience toward businesses, giving them feedback and whatnot. The name of that term is elusive to me right now. But if you're trying to increase the productivity of a business or of even your own life, and et cetera, add accountability to it. But what happens if you begin to subtract accountability away? How do you figure that plays out? So this is something important to consider. And he's talking about we need to get rid of this concept of free will. Like, we really don't have a choice about the things we're doing. So get rid of all notions of responsibility and accountability. What Bob might not know is that this has already been done. This was already tried other times in many ways, but I mention liberal Missouri quite often because it's a notable failed atheist experiment where hundreds of families moved in together. They created their own atheist town and atheist community, and it went downhill so fast that everybody got out. Also, any kind of communist belief system in the world, believes that there's nothing beyond this life. And so then you incorporate power grabbing and control, and the world does basically go to hell. He further, at least, is honest with us and says, and I should add, about 90 to 95% of philosophers agree that there's a free will and steadfastly hold on to it. So he realizes that he's on the outs. At least we've got that. He says, basically, in the times of what we would think is a decision-making moment, he said, what have the previous months been? What's the previous trauma, stimulation, whatever in terms of neuroplasticity? That is a good question. Let's just think about neuroplasticity for a second. What is that? The definition of neuroplasticity is also known as neural plasticity or just plasticity, is the ability of neural networks in the brain to change through growth and reorganization. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to reorganize and rewire its neural connections, enabling it to adapt and function in ways that differ from its prior state. So basically, the brain has the ability to adapt, but does it always adapt? And why or why not? And we already know this because there are causes in life that have effects that we don't prefer. And so going through that, a lot of times we start filing things away and we're like, hey, I want to get a handle on this. I want to get control of this. And we're going to change how we respond to this. But he's like, oh, we can't really change how we respond to this. And before you know it, you're back to adolescence. And your last group of gasp of constructing your frontal cortex and childhood and fetal environment and its epigenetic consequences and, of course, the genes. Okay, he said you're just kind of in this pool of things. Sorry, I'm adjusting my camera because it's sliding on me. He says, amazingly, at that point, you have to push farther back. What sort of culture were your ancestors inventing and what sort of ecosystems prompted those inventions? Because that was influencing how your mother was mothering you within minutes of birth. And when, some evolution thrown in for good measure. Well, what is he even saying here? Well, notice what he says. What sort of culture were your ancestors inventing? And what sort of ecosystems prompted those inventions? Well, one thing he forgets to mention is that, just randomness invented and stimulation in environment just happened to invent consciousness and decision-making and memory and morality and the concept of God and the concept of conscious. And, all of these things just kind of transpired. We didn't have any choice about these things transpiring, which is, I obviously disagree with this because I don't see how those things just were randomly invented. And for him to even use the term inventing, it implies that there has to be some sort of intelligence to invent something. This is what we're used to seeing. But he's claiming that these things just kind of happened. And that, I think, his language is there even betraying him. Well, the sort of jerky challenge that I lay down at this point is, okay, so you're still holding out for free will somewhere in there, just because it seems so counterintuitive if that is all we are. Well, why does it seem counterintuitive there, Bob? Why does it seem counterintuitive that we believe in a free will? It's because, scientifically, this is something I can test every single day. Things happen to me, and I decide how I'm going to respond to that. And I don't go with my epigenetics and genes and all this kind of stuff. Sometimes I have self-control and go against those things. And sometimes I recraft circumstances. Sometimes I know better and don't do it. Sometimes I'm in a bad predicament and I do better. We practice free will. And so it's really no wonder to think opposite of that is counterintuitive. But here's where I want you to start paying attention. But look at some behavior. You just pulled the trigger on a gun. Bam! Somebody shoots somebody. Like something very consequential. Why is this more consequential than anything else? Why do we even have a value system? But anyway. And you probably even identify those 3.5 neurons in the motor cortex that sent that command to your muscles. That's something I would really like to know. Can we really identify the exact 3.5 neurons that did this? Or is he just saying we might be able to do it? Show me. Let's examine those 3.5 neurons that just did that. Show me what they did that was completely impervious to what was going on in any other neurons surrounding them. But at the same time, show me that it was impervious to whether you were tired, stressed, sleepy, happy, well-fed at that moment. He's going with the whole classic, my environment shapes me, makes me do it kind of thing. Show me that it's impervious and would have done the exact same, that I would have done the exact same thing no matter what your hormone levels were this morning, no matter what your childhood was, no matter what your genome is or the epigenetics. Show me that if you would have done the exact same thing after changing any of those or all those variables, and as far as I'm concerned, you've just proven free will. And they can't, because there's absolutely nothing any of your like molecules making you up just did to generate a behavior that's independent of every second before. Here is a mistake, and he goes on to say, it is impossible to show that we can act freely of everything that came before. Now, I know this is a deep topic. It's been raging for a long time. But when he says it's impossible to show that we can act freely of everything before, he is making a mistake between continuity and direction. See, he's looking at these things, and this is the way we have to look at these things, is in a historical context. He's like, well, I was in a bad mood, and that made me pull the trigger. It was continuous. And he's like, show me how there was any free will in that. Well, free will actually has to have actuality to have possibility. See, there is actually no way to divorce free will from the entity that has free will. How are you going to do that? Because if you take away the substance of an entity that is trying to accomplish free will, or that you're trying to build with free will, once it has substance, just because it has substance doesn't mean it doesn't have directional qualities to it. It has to have a foundation point. So he is mixing up here continuity with the sake of direction. And the question I just have is, if we had free will, what would it look like? Well, it would have to have, again, something to be housed in, but just because you're housed in it, we're like, does that necessarily mean it's no longer free in its choices? Well, here's where things get a little more interesting and following along in Sapolsky's thing here. He says, oh, well, at first pass, it's depressing as hell and alarming and unsettling and all of that. Yeah, if you think there's no free will and there's no meaning in the universe, it is alarming and unsettling. And all sorts of wise evolutionary biologists have thought about the evolution of self-deception. And by the time you're as smart as a primate, as we are, we have had to develop a robust capacity for not believing in what might be the case. This is loaded and packed with fantastic intellectual information. He says, because otherwise it would be all too overwhelming and despairing and just existential void and all that stuff. Yeah, it is depressing. It's alarming. It's overwhelming to know that there is nothingness waiting on me. There's got to be more. And he said, but when you get as smart as us and you realize that this is the truth, you have to develop a robust capacity for not believing in what might be the case. Why are they using the term might there? If he absolutely knows there's no free will, stand your ground, man. Don't ever use any kind of compromising language. But he knows that there's a free will because he utilizes it all the time, and I'll get to that in a second. But notice too, he says, we have developed a robust capacity for not believing in what might be the case. This is something that Hitchens has referred to as, in my opinion, cognitive dissonance, to be able to believe opposite things at the same time, just, keep them apart. Graham Oppie has talked about this as compartmentalization. Hey, they're conflicting data, let's just keep them apart. Here, Sapolsky is like, well, we've got to keep these things apart in our mind or we might go crazy. Well, this is wrong. It's wrong on both sides of the fence, and I'm going to try to explain this, and hopefully I don't just botch it. Number one, it's wrong because, like he says at the beginning of the interview here, it says it's counterintuitive to think that we don't have free will. You see, that's kind of our wiring, that's kind of our understanding, and that's kind of our daily scientific experience, is that we do, in fact, have free will. And so I have to divorce the concept from that because in reality, I know that's not true. So number one, I have to believe against the way I intuitively know and reason to begin with, because it might be the case. But then once you get there, once you get over to seeing life in that defunct state where there's no reason or purpose, like, oh, well, I got to shift back to the other side of the fence and ignore the bleakness of it because that's too depressing. Maybe you should have stayed on one side of the fence to begin with and go, hey, we do have free will and we're accountable for it. This is interesting. My overwhelming emphasis is, if you suddenly are convinced there's no free will, and that's a total bummer for you, because it makes your, like, egregious, privileged salary seem like something you didn't necessarily earn, and your prestigious degrees and your circle of loving friends and all the other things that you feel like, that make you feel like you, in some manner earn, deserve, you're entitled to. Oh, bummer. Like all of these things. There's my camera again sliding. I don't want to lose this thing. He's like, oh, that's a bummer when you figure this out? Oh, that's a bummer. When you really get your handle on this, oh, bummer. But he gets into reason. You got to be cognitively dissonant with it. If you'll listen to the statement, he says, if that's your response to the idea of there being no free will, by definition, you were one of the lucky ones. I think this is an insight into some of the things in the background. If you followed, I think if you probably followed Sapolsky a little closer and got to know him, you'd probably find out there were people in his life that had committed suicide because of how bleak it is if we don't make any choices or decisions, because it is an existential void and it's disturbing and it's awful. For most people on earth who are dealing with far less privilege, the notion that we are not captains of our fate is like wildly liberating. No, it's not. I do understand where he's coming from. He's talking about it's wildly liberating because if I can't control my animal instincts, yeah, baby, if I can't be held responsible for my animal instincts or my desires or my natural passions, then go live out those desires and passions. It's wildly liberating in the morality sense, but this is kind of backwards too, because it's not really wildly liberating because you're an animal chained to your passions and desires that y'all get to in a second. He said, I mean, just ask someone whose genetic profile and metabolism dooms them to obesity and being subject to a lifelong of unhappiness and societal stigma over that. That's just one of a billion ways in which we discover that we're nothing more or less than the biology over which we had no control and the environment over. This is great news and is most humane. It's the most humane thing on earth. No, it's not, because I'll tell you a secret. If you tell someone that has a propensity, like for instance, I have a propensity to eat, baby. I love to eat. And you just tell me, hey, there's no consequences to life and you can just eat whatever you want and you can't help it. You just eat. I will gain weight to unhealthy levels, to handicapping levels. I would do just like any other human being would do if you were just to totally imbibe something because you have no control over it. That's just kind of dumb. All we spend is the last 500 years of scientific insights into seeing that people are not responsible for all sorts of things which they used to be blamed or made feel that they are inadequate or burn at the stake for. This is wonderfully liberating, except that it's not, because basically what you do is when you say you can't control yourself, then people don't control themselves and they get caught up on these passions. Like if you tell somebody that's has an addiction to gaming, hey, it's not your fault. You can game all you want. Well, does anybody remember those kids that were falling dead several years ago in the cafes overseas because they were playing video games for 48 hours straight? You can't just tell people they're wildly liberated. There's no morality, because it creates more problems. And now here's something. This is kind of give you some more insight into where Robert Sapolsky's coming from his 14-year-old stance. About 50 years ago, the psychiatrist, sort of the old boy oligarchy, figured out that schizophrenia is not caused by mothers of psychodynamic hatred of their children, and instead it's a neurogenetic disorder. Now he just states this. Here he is, he's written a book and he's leading us into the frontiers of new ways of thinking. And he's like, psychiatry figured out what schizophrenia is. Well, I looked up Mayo Clinic, why schizophrenia exists, and it says, it isn't known what causes schizophrenia. Oh, so I went to the Cleveland Clinic. They said, there's no one single cause of schizophrenia. Experts suspect schizophrenia happens for different reasons. They're not 100% sure why. WebMD says, doctors don't know for sure what causes schizophrenia. The National Institute of Mental Health says several factors may contribute to a person's risk of developing schizophrenia. No, when somebody like this has just come on the scene, they tell you all about free will and they figured things out. The reason they figured it out is because they had an existential experience when they were 14 and they've clasped onto that and they're not turning back from it. It isn't because they really have good facts about these things. That is not the case. A little bit more and we'll push forward. So the challenge is just to imagine what things the people a century from now will be saying about our time period and things we still thought were volitional and things that we punished people for and things that we rewarded people for, where there was absolutely no basis for it. More practically, like, how are we supposed to function? It seems like the first sort of thing to get off the table is, oh my, we're all going to run amok because people will be unconstrained by, I can't be held responsible. Well, this isn't scientific, this isn't philosophy here, boss. When you tell people there's no restraint, guess what? They descend downhill. We have recent understanding of this. Anybody remember the land of or the border of or the city of Chaz? Like that's just a few years ago. We don't have rules. We don't have laws. Come here. Be us. We're us. Do whatever you want. So then the people start murdering and raping and stealing. And then they came out with a Marvel Comics task force where people walking around in these hero suits trying to stop crime or something. And it all had to break down because that's stupid to say that if you take away morality or laws and tell people that they don't have to control themselves and you can just jump into this and it's okay because it's just who you are, you're going to have stupid consequences. The next one that's got to be disposed of, like nonetheless, dangerous people need to be contained, and yes, absolutely. I want you to see Robert's thinking here, okay? He says, dangerous people need to be contained, and yes, absolutely. He's like, okay, so if we do pull down the barriers and tell everybody that they can live the way they want to live, etc., then, well, yeah, dangerous people, you're going to have to contain them. I want you to hold on to that thought. Hang on to it for just a second or so. Something I try to emphasize throughout the book is this incredibly difficult, Something I try to emphasize throughout the book is that this is incredibly difficult to think this way. Like, I've believed it since I was like early adolescence, and 99% of the time I can't manage to pull this off. This is not even the way he thinks. I'm terrible at it 99% of the time. Come on, dude. No wonder philosophers agree on this. No wonder people with common sense think we have free will. You can't just say we don't have free will. That is gross. It says, oh, this has been a little... Okay, and then let me, at the very end of this, I'm not getting in this part because, man, as scattered as some of his reading is, he almost sounds as scattered as I do sometime with his thinking, trying to make sense of two comments coming together. But he says, oh, this has been a little minor hobby of working with what are called public defenders, who are people who are assigned when some defendant can't afford their own attorney. This is a whole world of like liberal do-gooder attorneys who lose 95% of their cases. Now that's interesting here because he has just stated that dangerous people need to be locked up. And I'm not reading the rest of this interview here, but one of the things he's pointing out is that he's going in and testifying for public defenders who are trying to get murderers off. He's like, they're not responsible for their actions. This kid right here, maybe he was molested when he was little, and his older brothers beat him up, and he was thrown out of the house, etc. And so he's not responsible for his actions, and he's sitting there trying to convince. This thing is driving me nuts. He is trying to convince his people, or the people in the courtroom, that they're not responsible for their actions, that these criminals aren't responsible for their actions. But one of the reasons that Sapolsky is not convincing is because if he really believed this, wouldn't he look at the trial lawyer and the jury and the judge and go, they're not responsible for their actions either, so why am I trying to defend this position in the first place? So nothing Sapolsky says about the free will makes any sense, and having worked through it, I have not wasted my time, but now I've got another resource, at least, of somebody who is not worth listening to.